Well, good morning to everyone who's joining us. We appreciate giving us a little bit of time on your Tuesday, and we're excited to welcome you to the inaugural episode of Turbocharge tomorrow. Give everyone a few minutes as they come in. How you doing today, Paul?
Very good, Dan. Yeah, fantastic. I had family in town last weekend and I'm going to a music show tonight. So I'm having a good week overall. How about you?
Fabulous. That's a lot for a Tuesday.
Yeah, I know. Unexpected music show. Steve Earle, a bit of old country rock.
Outstanding. Nice.
Right.
It's been gorgeous in Chicago, so just trying to make sure I get my vitamin D, get out of the house a little bit.
Beautiful. Yeah, likewise here in New York, actually. Fantastic weather.
Fantastic. All right, we're going to give everyone just another minute or two, and then Paul will dive in and get started.
Wonderful. Yeah, really looking forward to it, Dan.
Awesome. What part of New York are you in?
Just outside the city, a place called Astoria.
Oh
Interestingly,
yeah.
it was my 14-year anniversary in New York last week.
Oh,
So
I love it.
time has flown. But yeah, I'm just right outside the city, close enough to commute and far enough from the madness.
Love it. I got to spend one summer in Manhattan with Google, and it was just
Oh, you
unbelievable.
did?
Yeah,
Goodness. I'm there quite often, actually. Their new offices are pretty
gorgeous.
spectacular. Yeah,
I know.
beautiful.
I know. All right, so I know some more folks are going to be joining, but in the spirit of time, we have a lot to cover today. So, Paul, we're going to dive in. To kick things off, I'm going to take you back to February of 2013. If you so happen to have been living in Los Angeles in February of 2013 and you subscribe to the Los Angeles Times, the headline would have read one day in February that Marissa Mayer pulls back all Yahoo employees to the office. At the time, Marissa was CEO of Yahoo. She had roughly 12,000 employees around the United States, around the globe. And one of her ideas was to give employees the freedom to work remotely. However, that experiment was not working. She felt like it was dampening innovation. It was actually slowing down the organization, and it caused a lot of consternation. But she knew at that time how difficult remote leadership was in distributed workforces. And so let's fast forward to obviously March of 2020. At the time, only about 5% of employees are working remote. And COVID hits. And now everyone has to become a remote leader. And that's exactly what we're here to do, Paul, to talk about today. I want to welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Turbocharge tomorrow. It's pretty interesting with everything that we're seeing, all the technology pushing us forward. I feel like there's moments where we're actually taking steps back. If you think, Paul, about the great resignation or quiet quitting, and that's exactly what these episodes are designed to do is how do we empower, support software delivery leaders to pull forward the best strategies and the best technologies to actually make an impact on their day-to-day and their teams. So if you're not familiar with Distillery, we accelerate innovation through an unyielding approach to nearshore software delivery. And Paul, I'd love it if you were to give our audience a little bit of a background on yourself before we dive into the conversation.
Yeah, for sure, Dan. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to discuss this super important topic. I'll be brief. I've been working in the digital space for almost 20 years across enterprise, consulting, and now as an entrepreneur, building my own business. So for the majority of that 20 years, I've been bringing digital products to market. So I've seen it all. We've led sizable distributed teams across the globe. And the through line for me across all of that is how do we build high performant organizations to bring great products to life for our customers? So incredibly important and exciting topic for me to jump into today, Dan. I think you make a good point around the changing dynamics across the globe today. But I want to take a step back. Building organizations, teams, and products is really, really hard. And I know everyone on the call has a sense for that. But if we take this to first principles, building software products is not necessarily, right? So we identify a problem, we choose a solution based on a number of different frameworks that we'll roll out. We'll build that solution, we'll bring it to market, and we iterate, right? So from a very kind of, I suppose, first principles system, it's not overly complex. But when you start adding constituent parts like C-suite executives with specific goals, and customers with a wide array of criteria that needs to satisfy their problems, internal employees with certain inherited biases, and then the technical infrastructure that exists within that organization. It starts to get really complicated
Yep.
really fast. And then as you start to take some of those constituent parts and shift them across the globe, you're now dealing with potential cultural misalignments,
Yep.
potential time zone misalignments. So the key thing for me, Dan, is figuring out how we can reduce that complexity, how we can make sure that as we shift these organizations to a more global posture, we reduce that complexity that's inherent as we scale products to ensure that we're driving high performant organizations and bringing these
Love it, Paul.
exceptional products to market.
Love it. All right, let's rock and roll. You already dove in, which is fabulous. So the first topic today we're talking about is leading from afar. And I want to pick up on something you mentioned, and it's this idea of complexity kills. And, simplicity is so critical, whether it be simplicity of processes or procedures in leading, in rolling out communications. But we have things like, generative AI, for one example. There's a lot of different opinions. How should it be used? Whether it should be used. And so there's a lot of those conversations here. So first topic we really want to drill into is this idea of complexity, and how do software delivery leaders distill that down and keep things simple to keep things moving forward in the face of an ever-growing complex world?
Yeah, fantastic point, Dan. So the easy thing to do there, the low-hanging fruit for companies that embark on this journey and have likely never done it before, is to focus on the technology. But I want to take us a little bit deeper than that, because there's three fundamental core initiatives that we need to focus on in order to ensure that we can lead successful globally distributed organizations. So at the very base of this, we need to focus on organizational strategy, psychology, and culture. Sounds a little bit esoteric and
Yep.
waffly, but essentially what I mean there is that we need to ensure that globally we've a sense for who we are. What is our DNA as an organization? Are we customer centric? Do we have psychological safety across the board where folks can really make decisions and take risks to grow these products, right? And there's a whole multitude of other things that we focus on, but the core foundational point that we need to ensure is in place before we scale globally is our organizational strategy and culture. That's 101.
Sure.
Above that, right, we focus on approach. And think of this as a pyramid, almost a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But above that, we've got then our approach to product, right, to bringing different products to market. And there's a lot of different schools of thought here. Do we want to be a feature factory across the board, right, where we're taking directives from our C-suite and we're effectively just building out features against the timeline with no real autonomy across the team? I would advocate for no. What I've seen is the approach that's best in globally distributed organizations to bring new products to market is building out empowered product teams where each individual or each team has the ability to make the right decision for their product in order to bring that to market without, let's say directives or hand-holding treatment for, let's say, the executives within the organization. And then the last point, Dan, is really what everyone focuses on, right? This is our tools, our technologies, and our platforms. What I've seen in my time leading organizations and consulting and working with global companies is as they scale, they might invest in Slack or Miro or try to understand how we can run workshops globally. Really important, but it's not really touching on the nuance of how we can build these organizations from the ground up as global software development organizations.
Interesting. There's so much to unpack right there. But I guess one of the things I heard is it comes down to some of the fundamentals. Maybe the fundamentals are becoming more important than ever. So if you think of values, right? Do you have 3 to 5 very simplistic values that your team members can maybe play back to you and that govern some of those behaviors? Or do you have a couple of core beliefs that are informed by the changes that are happening or inside the organization? And can your team members right now play those beliefs back to you? Because guess what? If you're trying to inform every decision, and especially in a globally distributed team, you're going to feel like you're playing whack-a-mole. And that's never a good feeling, both for you as a leader or for your employees. Is that fair?
I think that's spot on, Dan. And I think in particular, that third point, can your team play that back to you? So many executives, and I've been part of this world, assume that the strategy and the DNA and culture of an organization is known across the organization. When polled, individuals typically don't. So when you feel like you've said this ad nauseum, say it 100 more times.
Yeah.
And only when people can articulate what those values are back to you and live and breathe
Yeah.
those values, are you certain that you have the ability and the foundation to really scale globally in a successful way.
How do you advocate, leaders? Those are some of the softer skills, and I know I struggle with them sometimes. How do you build those? How do you reinforce those? How do you even make sure you're carving enough time out on a day-to-day basis to focus on some of that softer stuff when there's so much time demands on some of the harder stuff, or moving product forward or reviewing product roadmaps?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, you have to live your values, right? I don't want to be cliched in any of these answers, but I do think that if you try to, enforce this from the top down in a way that doesn't reflect how you live and breathe as an executive or a leader within the organization, it's tough. And to your point, it takes time. You're
Yeah.
creating decks and trying to enforce these values that you're not really living and breathing. So the best organizations that I've worked with, Dan, it's effectively a DNA and a set of values that is inhibited and that is shown and reflected every day from the
Yeah.
leadership team. So if transparency, as an example, is something that we value as a principle within the organization, and you're telling everyone that they should effectively live and breathe this value, but you're not then being transparent as a leader,
Sure.
or hiding answers, it's never going to take hold. So I think that the real way to do that, that's not a time suck and that comes across as genuine, is to live and breathe the values as an executive team and allow them to then percolate within the organization.
Awesome. So before we move on, I always appreciate kind of even just tangible takeaways. So what I'm hearing is technology will always be inherently complex, especially in the early stages. But going back to some of the foundations, things like values, if you value, to your point, transparency or rapid experimentation, that people understand that value and what it means, they can embrace that in the face of growing complexity.
Correct. Yep. You got
Awesome.
it.
So as we think about kind of the complexity and simplicity, like we're going to talk about a pretty big word. And you might have to go back to like third year at university, but this idea of organizational psychology. I go back to, again, those soft skills that are so important for us as leaders these days. Paul, we might not cover it all, but how do we even begin to unpack the importance and the power of organizational psychology for leaders in building fantastic teams in a distributed world?
Yeah, great question. And I'm loath to come across as too academic or, obtuse in these kinds of conversations, Dan. So let's make this very real. Organizational psychology is super simple, right? We don't speak it every day, but we typically live it, right? Organizational psychology is effectively the study of human and group behavior in the workplace with a goal of creating a high performant organization focused on workplace productivity, retaining employees, and improved job satisfaction, right, at its core. And most people do that on a daily basis. They just don't necessarily use the word. The reason I'm really keen to double down and emphasize this is because it's so critical to understanding how we can build high performant
Yep.
organizations. And I'll give you a very real example of this, Dan. So about 8 years ago, Google, being Google, did a study across their workforce to better understand what criteria led to high performant teams within their organization. And they studied every criteria you can possibly imagine: how many times per week these teams have lunch together, what grades these teams had, where they were local or not local to the office. None of these things were material in determining the success or otherwise of most teams. But there was one criteria that's not overly intuitive that showed up in every team that was high performant within the Google ecosystem. And that criteria was psychological safety. So what that means is effectively that individuals feel safe within a team environment to take risks, to put their
Yeah.
ideas forward, to rapid prototype certain ideas out without fear of retribution should those ideas not work. Counter to that, they had a lot of teams within their organization that had a dictatorial leader, or some
Yep.
folks were more introverted than extroverted. Those teams fared out worse, even where they had on paper potentially more qualified individuals. So to get back to your question, Dan, organizational psychology is really just a study of our organization.
Yeah.
we need to embed that within our organization globally as we think about distributing the workforce. And the real reason, Dan, is again, because when we're leading from afar, you do have different cultures, and some cultures are, less confident in speaking in meetings. Other cultures are more confident in speaking in meetings. We have to make sure that we level the playing field so that this is a key attribute across all teams in order to ensure that we are confident as individuals
Yeah.
within team. We're getting security from our teams, and more importantly than all of this, we're actually high performant. We're driving great products
Yeah.
through the market.
Yeah. What comes to mind as I listen to you talk is like, there's no shortcuts here. Like, there's
Yeah.
no easy button for creating psychological safety. And especially too, I think of very dynamic software delivery teams, very dynamic teams that will have probably onshore, nearshore, maybe even offshore components, that you have partners and vendors in addition to your core team. And you have team members that may be coming and going with some clip, right? And it's like, how do you even begin as a leader to not only create that core safety on that team, embed those values, but then when you do have either a new team rolling on or new team members rolling on, it would seem to make sense that the faster you create that psychological safety for a new team member, the further that they're going to gel with that team, the faster that team is going to move, and the more quote unquote productivity, if that's what you're looking for, you're going to achieve as a leader, right?
Right, 100%. And it's a great question, right? You're anchoring this all back to the how. And I love that, Dan. So, one example is there's a book called Culture Code. I encourage everyone to go and read it. But there was a really good anecdote in it, or a set of anecdotes, which highlighted the inverse. As we have individuals that are, let's quote unquote, toxic or not positive for the environment, those individuals dramatically drag down performance across the rest of the team. So I think there's a couple of ways in which we can do this. I mean, it starts with hiring, right? If we want to get very specific about this, this is part of your values. It's part of who you are as an organization. It starts with hiring. You ensure that you're hiring individuals that fit that philosophy, that are not, command and control leaders, and you're bringing them on. They're then
Yeah.
filtering this across their organization. But you're spot on. As you start to percolate that across the organization, you do start seeing all of these introverted or less vocal individuals speak up and really drive value for their teams and the organization in a way that potentially wasn't possible prior.
Yeah, absolutely. I could agree more and go back to the how, some of this stuff, especially for a senior leader that's built teams or has led large teams. I don't know if some of these components that we're talking about here are like revolutionary or introducing something new, but I just keep going back to, even as a leader myself, like, it's about carving out that time and that headspace and putting those ceremonies or those meetings on people's calendars, or it's looking at that onboarding schedule for that next team member. And yes, often what we'll see is the best onboarding schedules will be organized. And again, they'll cover off on all the technical aptitudes. And here's what you need to, here's who do you need to meet, and then some of the deadlines that you need to meet. But, do we have ceremonies or facets on there around those values or around building that organizational, that psychological safety, excuse me.
Yeah, and I think that's key, right? So, in other words, how do we take the intangible and make it tangible?
Yes.
That's
Well
exactly
said.
and right. Yeah, sorry. So that's
No.
exactly it, right? How do we manifest this in our teams? And that's been, my career for 18 years has not been in kind of the obtuse or the academic. It's very much been leading these teams and these organizations to manifest these results. And that's it, right? So we take these values, we ensure that they're being spread out across the teams through sessions, through manifest and performance reviews, and over time you'll start seeing that those results within those teams. But it will take, actually, Dan, surprisingly less time than you might think. It sounds like a big organizational change. It's really not. There's an example that I'll give in a moment, Dan, around how leading with intent really drives that culture. And within organizations, and certainly organizations that I've worked with, some of these changes that seem fairly philosophical and organizational,
Yep.
take just 2 weeks to start to manifest. As you start seeing your leader behave in a certain way, all of a sudden, individuals at the team level start behaving in that way
Yeah.
too. These behaviors start taking hold. So it can take quite a short amount of time in
Yeah.
comparison to what folks may think, surprisingly.
No, I love that. I think going back as leaders and remembering that study after study after study has shown that it takes 2 to 3 weeks of intention to build a new habit. So even as leaders, do we have a list of habits that we're trying to build inside our organizations, and making sure, one, we don't have too many habits that we're trying to either build or shape, but also that we're cognizant that when we wake up, we maybe have a Post-it note and saying, I'm trying to reinforce these behaviors,
Right.
and it's going to take time. So maybe we need to be a little bit more patient as leaders in doing that, right?
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely, Dan.
All right, Paul, I'm going to keep us moving. I love that both, like, there's this fine line between, for us, being a student of the game, understanding some of the research, but also the application. So I want to talk about leadership. When you talk about, think about leadership principles and kind of some of the latest research, where is that taking you as far as, again, a really big topic? We're going to try and chunk it down into some very tangible pieces here. But where are you focusing on with your clients in the realm of leadership when it comes to building high performing distributed teams?
Yeah, I want to throw out an anecdote here, Dan, that will hopefully make some of this real. And it's focused on, I would say, an umbrella leadership style that, eventually leads to a number of different skill sets being percolated across the organization. So, briefly, there was a leader in the Navy by the name of David Marquette about 8 years ago. He was one of the top leaders for the top submarine in the Navy, and he was asked to take on a different submarine. It was the submarine that was least performant, lowest performance submarine over 5 or 6 different years. And when he took it on, he realized, well, hold on a second, I don't know anything about this submarine. It's new technology. I've never used it before. How can I possibly work within this ecosystem
Mm-hmm.
to improve the performance of 120 crewmates? So he did, and he took it on. And what he said was, I'm going to lead with intent. So no longer am I going to give specific orders to these individuals. I'm going to lead with intent. I'm going to tell them what the North Star is for a given
Yeah.
week, month, or day, or year, or however long. I'm going to tell them what I think our mission is and our vision is. And they are the people with the most knowledge, closest to the decision point. They should be making the decision for every single thing that we do in terms of how we reach that vision.
Yeah.
Without going through every single piece of the nuance in that, that submarine went from the lowest performing to the highest score that the Navy had ever seen in the history of, this scoring mechanism in the space of 12 months. Now, this guy was obviously an incredible leader, right? And did a multitude of other things outside of simply changing his philosophy. But when I think about leading globally, Dan, what's less and less, I would say, valuable is command control leadership. You've got people across the globe in different teams expected in different time zones to produce results. The best leaders that I've seen are able to stand back, lead with intent, trust that their teams in all of these different locations across the globe can execute on those commands and make decisions to drive the team forward. So it's a hard philosophy for leaders to
Yeah.
get behind, right? There's a certain amount of ego that exists within the leadership group that you have to stand back from because you're no longer making all of the nuanced decisions. And maybe there's a middle ground as you get to that kind of end game. But especially as we start looking at globally distributed workforces, it's really important to not have silos, not have bottlenecks, and not have, in my opinion, this dictatorial command control model, which
Yeah.
really slows down productivity and unempowers or disempowers the workforce across the globe.
It's so darn hard, and I think about going back to the first one, that simplicity, and kind of a lot of what we're talking about here, Paul, is layering on top of one another. What I heard you say is, really communicating that clear vision, right? And we talked about some of those values, maybe those being the guardrails. I believe that was the commander's intent, right? As far
Sure.
as the communication of that. So really slowing down, really carving out, and again, for folks kind of listening here, that vision for teams as they move forward. What do you think holds, again, I don't know if that's groundbreaking, but what do you think holds leaders back from doing more of that?
Yeah, so there's two key things in my view, Dan. There's technical competence and organizational clarity. So in other words, in order for this model to work, there has to be confidence in the workforce that they have the competence, the technical or product or otherwise competence to execute on these commands. Now, whether that's the trust is not yet there or the workforce is not yet at that point, that's a key dependency on this model working, right? So you hire individuals that are at the right level to execute on those commands and an organizational clarity, right? So in other words, if you have a leader who enforces or who stands back and kind of allows for these teams to move forward, but these teams don't have the organizational clarity or the confidence or otherwise to actually execute autonomously, that's really tough. So the two key things, Dan, are there has to be a level of competence and therefore trust in the workforce, and there has to be organizational clarity across the board that this is how we organize or execute as a group.
I love it. Awesome. Okay, I think we have time enough for one big meaty topic, and it's around decision making. So kind of putting a lot of these different components that we're talking about together, when rubber meets the road at the very tactical level, when a team member anywhere throughout the world makes a decision. One of my favorite frameworks, Paul, you can always make decisions one of three ways. Either the leader can come with a semi-baked kind of set of standards to say, this is how it goes. The second could be a straw man, where it's loosely defined, and then they let the team kind of determine how to take it from there or how to extrapolate it. And the third being coming with a blank slate, a blank page, right? Sure. Often that third piece is consensus or consensus decision making. So I want to ask you kind of a bold question is, do you believe consensus decision making kind of kills organizational morale, slows down productivity, and kind of brings things to a halt?
Yes, 100%. I am a strict proponent of decisive organizations. Now, there's some caveats to that, right? So I want to go back to an initial point that we made. Dan, when we think of psychological safety, it's not consensus decision making. A lot of people, equate both. It's not at all. Consensus decision making for me is probably the biggest killer of productivity in an organization, right? So when I think about decision making, and this is an often valued skill set for organizations to have, but when I think about decision making, I am really keen on ensuring that individuals have accountability for certain decisions and autonomy to make those decisions independently, right? Very, very clearly put. Now, I do want to caveat that. Netflix have a really good model that I'm a proponent of called farming for dissent. So as individuals need to make probably meaty decisions, right? The less meaty decisions, I feel, let's move forward. If you have 60% of the knowledge, let's move forward. The reversible decisions, make the decision, and we can always pivot back if necessary. Yeah. For the irreversible decisions, right, the bigger decisions, Netflix are a proponent of this philosophy called farming for dissent. You still have one individual that's accountable for making that decision. It's not a consensus-driven organization. But what they must do is farm for dissent. So send out that memo or that opinion piece to the organization, farm for dissent. It's still the decision of that individual at the end of the day to move forward, as opposed to a consensus-driven organization. So in short answer, Dan, and I know we're up on time, absolutely. I think consensus-driven decision-making is nice to start with from a cultural perspective. People feel heard. People feel that every thought that they have goes into every decision that's made. Over time, I think that erodes confidence and morale as they become the decision makers, and it absolutely slows your organization down as you try to compete with the best in market.
Yeah. But I just heard you say it's a yes, and it is soliciting that feedback and that input that we know makes ideas better, right? 100%. But at the end of the day, maintaining that accountability to that one individual to make it, and there's fear, right? There's risk in doing that. But as leaders, we have to have that balance, and we have to kind of monitor for that balance. If we feel like there's too much input, or the input is leading folks to defer some of that accountability or defer some of that decision-making to encourage that individual, to your point, to create that psychological safety, to make that leap, to make that decision. And especially if it's one of those reversible ones, that can pivot, right?
Agreed. Yeah, I have a very kind of strong feeling on the democratization of decision-making that I won't get into in detail today, but very simply put, the authority for a decision should be closest to the knowledge of that decision. So in other words, let's not kind of bottleneck every decision with leadership within an organization. If you've got a client leader or a software leader that knows the most about whatever decision that is, they should be fully empowered to make that decision and move forward.
Awesome. All right, Paul, I'm going to get you out of here on this. It is the inaugural episode of Turbocharge tomorrow. And we are all about here pulling tomorrow forward today. So I don't know if this is going to be a challenging kind of question to get you out of here on, but what is one thing that you would have our audience, our listeners, our watchers pull forward? One item that this afternoon they would go to their teams and they would execute or their implement in order to achieve potentially, fast track some of that productivity, fast track whatever it is that they're trying to further. What would that one thing be, Paul?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dan. And this is actually quite straightforward for me because I've been preaching this for many, many years. So in all of the products that I've seen go to market, and of all of the products that failed that went to market, there was one key component in the majority of those failures. And it wasn't technology, it wasn't the people. The failure in the majority of the products that did not necessarily sit well with customers was that the organization did not understand the customers, nor the customer's problem nor intention. Really, really clear. And a lot of organizations think they do and inevitably don't when we get to market. So a very tangible program that I've spun up and encourage every leader I speak to spin up is a program that focuses on building a culture whereby every single employee that builds out digital products must sit with their customers periodically to understand their challenges, to empathize, to see things from their perspective. We can create the best products, right, from a UI perspective in the world, especially now that we've AI entering the fray. But if we don't fundamentally understand our customers, or worse, if we think we understand our customers, but we don't, we're really doomed to fail every time. And that's a really tangible program that we've put in place. Interestingly, DoorDash and a multitude of other organizations do this. They force or enforce a program whereby all of their employees, inclusive of leadership, with customers, deliver to customers to fundamentally understand their challenges. So really tangible program that will manifest in fantastic results from a digital product perspective, Dan.
Another fantastic reminder, customer first, Paul.
For sure.
Well, I want to thank you so much for all the wisdom and the insights here today. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the inaugural episode of Turbocharge tomorrow. We have lots more to come, but thank you, Paul. We appreciate you sharing a little bit of your wisdom with us this morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Dan. Take care and have a wonderful week.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.